Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Natalie Kladek, and I am a product manager here at HBS Online, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our discussion today with Professor Mihir Desai. I'd also like to thank everyone who is here and who has submitted questions in advance. We're definitely going to do our best to get through as many of those as we can. And if you have questions during the conversation, please feel free to submit those using the Q&A function in Zoom or in the comment section if you're joining us on social media, and we'll cover those as well. And then I'd also just like to remind everyone, if you've registered for the session, you'll be entered in a drawing to receive a digital copy of Professor Desai's book, How Finance Works. And if you haven't registered yet, there's still time. You can either, if you're joining us on Zoom, you've already registered, and if you're joining us on Facebook or LinkedIn, we'll go ahead and just drop that link in the comment section so you can go ahead and register now and be entered in that drawing, and we'll go ahead and notify the winners after the session. So before we dive in, I'd just like to briefly introduce our speaker today, Mihir Desai. Professor Desai is the Mizuho Financial Group Professor of Finance at Harvard Business School and a Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. But most importantly to our audience today, he developed our HBS Online course, Leading with Finance. And because I'm sure you are much more interested in hearing from him than from me, I will go ahead and turn it over. The floor is all yours.
Hi, Natalie, and everybody out there. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Natalie. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you and to be talking about finance. I thought what we could do is spend a little time going through some slides. I just have a few ideas that I thought I would try to get across. And then we'll dive in and do a Q&A, because I'm sure that's going to be more fun than me talking at you. So maybe we'll do 20 plus minutes of slides, and then we'll dive into a Q&A. Okay, great. So let's just dive in and see if my little Zoom technology works here for sharing slides. I wanted to share some slides with you about fixing finance. So as I was thinking about what I could talk to you about, I was trying to think about the variety of my efforts over the last couple of years, and to think about how finance can be fixed, because I think parts of finance, in fact, are broken. And the question becomes, how do we fix it? So let me try to share some ideas about that with you. Some of it involves the course that we built with HBS Online, some of it involves some books, and some of it, I confess, involves a new project that I have. And I wanted to also use this as an opportunity to get some feedback about that project. All right, great. So here's the underlying story, which is I think finance is just critically important to our lives as citizens, workers, and individuals. So to be an informed citizen means to understand the role of capital markets, to understand the role of taxes and savings and retirement. I think that's just hugely important. To be a successful worker and manager, you have to understand finance, because it is the language with which we communicate. And in society generally, finance has never been more important and more forceful as a force in capitalism, for better or worse. So we have to try to understand finance. Unfortunately, it remains, I think, obscure, intimidating, and in that process, it gets demonized by most people. So what do I mean by that? So obscure is just a way of saying people kind of push it out of their lives because they don't really want to try to understand it, and they think it's a bunch of stuff that is very complicated, and that's not really worth trying to understand, and that's just not true. Second, I think people find it intimidating. They think it's rocket science, and that's a fiction that's kind of perpetrated in part by people in finance who like to try to intimidate other people. It's their source of power, and they use it with acronyms to try to intimidate you. And we want to make sure and try to get around that, because I think it ends up being bad for finance. And then finally, of course, finance is demonized, which is just a way of saying people blame a lot of things on the financial system, and I don't think they appreciate all the things that it's doing. That doesn't mean finance is like God's work. Far from it. There is significant problems with the way finance works, but demonization actually doesn't help that process. So the question becomes, how do we fix all that? So here's my effort to try to do that, and it kind of takes three pillars. But the short version is we have to demystify finance. And I chose that word because I think there is this mystique around it, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, that ends up hurting all of us as citizens, workers, and individuals. So I'm going to try to take you through some ideas about how to demystify finance. Okay, and so it turns out, I think there are three legs to this stool. The first is we really want to humanize finance. And I'll walk you through some ideas about it. But in short, finance has gotten lost, and the people in finance have gotten lost in spreadsheets and screens, and they've forgotten about the humanity of what finance is really all about. So the first thing is we got to humanize finance. The second thing is we have to explain finance in a better way and in a more thoughtful way than we've been doing. That will make it more accessible as well. And then finally, and this is the one that is a little bit more speculative, is we really need to personalize finance. We need to rescue personal finance from the kind of junky stuff that is being peddled out there. So how are we going to try to do this? Or what have I been trying to try to do this? And this is obviously in a way of made me think about different things that I've done and try to put them together in one kind of way to think about the world. So here's what I've been trying to do, and I just want to walk you through ideas on each of these. So the first part about humanizing finance, I got started on this by giving a kind of last lecture type of thing at HBS, and it turned into a book, and it's called The Wisdom of Finance. And I want to take you through some ideas about that. Then on explaining finance, I want to take you through some ideas that I developed while developing this online course that Natalie mentioned called Leading with Finance. And that, of course, also became a book called How Finance Works. And I thought I would take you through some ideas about that. And then finally, the more speculative version of this, which is about personalizing finance. And how do we take the personal finance field and inject it with some rigor, but still make it intuitive and accessible. And that's a little bit more speculative, but I'll take you through some ideas about that. And maybe you can tell me if it's a promising idea or not. So I confess that's more in the spirit of market research than anything else. Okay, great. So let's just dive in and I'll go through each of these. I'm not sure how much time we'll have altogether to do all of them, but I thought we could just take a stab at each of them. So on humanizing finance, this began when I was asked to give a talk to graduating students. And my first idea was to do something about share buybacks. This was 5 years ago, and about the slow motion LBO of America. And then I was told it had to have wisdom in it. So I came up with the title, The Wisdom of Finance. I had no idea what that meant. But like many times in life, you commit to doing something, and before you know it, you figure it out. And as I began to think about that and give that talk, I realized that these things, the idea of wisdom and finance, are usually not put together. But in fact, the underlying ideas of finance have a lot of wisdom in them. And in that effort, I kind of gave this talk and received a bunch of wonderful feedback from folks, and I turned it into a book. When I told my publisher I wanted to title it The Wisdom of Finance, he said, you know, it's good to be a little provocative in your titles, but oxymorons don't usually work, which is a way of saying nobody puts those two words together. But I think they should. And that in some sense is the point. Much in the spirit of what C.P. Snow tried to do with science and the humanities. I live this when I kind of spend some time at the business school, but then I cross the river to the university, and there's just a gulf between those two places. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think humanities can illuminate finance, and I think finance can actually help us understand our humanity. I started the book with this quote from Wallace Stevens, which is, "Money is a kind of poetry." And the reason I like that quote and I like Wisdom of Finance is nobody puts together money and poetry. You might think Wallace Stevens is like some Gordon Gekko-like investment banker guy. Wallace Stevens, in fact, was, I think, arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American poet of the 20th century. But here's the thing about Wallace Stevens is he spent his entire career working in insurance. He worked at the Hartford Insurance Company his whole life, and he loved insurance, and he loved poetry. And all his friends would kind of make fun of him as if he were some bourgeois kind of insurance executive. But he always thought those two worlds were closer together than people allowed. And I think that's the spirit of this whole kind of effort in a way. All right, so let's just go through a couple of those ideas and see what we can make of it. Underneath it all, the idea is that some people in finance think that you can explain everything with equations and graphs. And the reality is it just doesn't work for many, many, many people. The reality is people understand the world through stories. And so we should be able to explain finance through stories. And in that possibility, we can open up the world of finance to lots of people. Second, people in finance need a different way to think about their own ideas. And humanities make you think about those ideas in a more gentle, humane kind of way. And in that process, I think we understand that the ideas of finance aren't something that are just the product of the last 50 years, but actually have been with us for millennia. We've been doing finance and thinking about finance, for 2-3 millennia now. In that process, maybe we can actually make finance better. So what does that mean? Other possibilities are regulation and outrage. I don't really believe in necessarily either of them is going to help that much because they have some bad side effects. Actually, when we re-anchor the practice of finance in the ideas and ideals of finance, maybe we can rehabilitate finance. That's not going to change things tomorrow, but it's a long run game that I'm in and I hope you're in. And I think that's how we make things better. So what does this look like? So I just thought I would walk you through a little bit of the spine of the book. These are all the big ideas of finance, as far as I can tell. I didn't actually name the chapters these things, because if I did, nobody would buy it because it would have turned into a textbook. But underneath it, there's like, this is the intellectual spine of the book. What are the big ideas? Risk and insurance, the omnipresence of risk and the centrality of insurance to all kinds of parts of our lives. How do you manage risk? That's all about options and diversification. How do you know if you're creating value? How do you measure value? How do you do valuation? How do we think about what happens when ownership and control get separated? That's corporate governance. How do we think about mergers? How do we think about leverage and borrowing? How do we think about bankruptcy? The pictures I have there are something I'm quite proud of, which is I had to really push my publisher to include these pictures, but these are the pictures that start every chapter. And the underlying idea is every chapter kind of begins with a story from the humanities to explain a big idea in finance. And then we talk about that idea via the humanities. And then we talk about how that idea actually has a lot of salience for us as human beings, not just as finance people. So some of you may recognize the woman who is in the middle of the top row. Power to you if you do. It's Jane Austen. So instead of talking about options and diversification in the usual way, which is with payoff diagrams and Black-Scholes formula, instead we can use Jane Austen. Because in fact, most of her books are about, in some sense, a very fundamental risk management problem. She's very clear, men can make mistakes, but women cannot make mistakes, specifically in the kind of marriage market. So what's the plot line of a bunch of her books, including Pride and Prejudice? Risk management situation, woman, Lizzie Bennet, suitors come along. The first one is rich, but drunk. The second one is nice, but poor. The third one is funny, but ugly, whatever. And you kind of have to think about how many more chances do I get? And in fact, of course, in those stories, Mr. Collins, as one example, plays off the risk aversion. The really neat thing is the protagonist of her novels and other similar kinds of novels anticipate the basic risk management strategy of options and diversification in the way they talk about that problem. So this thing that we think of as being something that, a couple of economists invented in the 60s is not at all the case. We've been doing options and diversification forever. And it's actually very core to who we are. So that's the first part of that chapter. And then the second part of that chapter is optionality as a way to think about your life. And this is something that I have noticed more and more, which is I see young people talk about their lives in the terms of optionality, especially in finance. People love talking about optionality and they love acquiring optionality. What does that mean? I want to have more choices. What's optionality? Well, I can be able to do things. That's what an option is. And what I talk about in the book is, unfortunately, many folks kind of mislearn the big lesson of optionality and finance, which is they think it's all about acquiring options. And what they forget is that in that process of acquiring options, which is what I see a lot of young people doing, going to school or going to an employer or going to some association or trying to acquire optionality, they forget that the point of acquiring optionality is to actually undertake a big, huge risk. It's insurance. And instead, what they kind of become accustomed to is just buying more and more optionality. And then they spend 20 years buying optionality. And that is a tragedy. And I think it's a mislearning of the kind of big idea of options. Optionality has no value in and of itself. It is only so that you can undertake big risks. Unfortunately, people underestimate the degree to which buying safety nets is addictive. And then they spend, chunks of their lives buying safety nets. Okay, that gives you a sense of that kind of whole effort and what that's about. One particular example of that is in the value creation and valuation chapter. This is a picture that, I won't do this because I just did the Jane Austen thing, but this is a picture of the parable of the talents. For some of you who may recognize it, which actually has, and this is from the book of Matthew, which actually has the central lesson of value creation and valuation that we teach in finance embedded in it. And in fact, the founder of Methodism, who used John Wesley Mitchell, who used this parable, I think translated it or kind of spoke about it in a way that is just exactly an analog to what we teach in finance about value creation, about beating your cost of capital, about sustaining that for a long period of time. It has a kind of almost eerie analog in this parable, which of course is considerably older than most finance textbooks. Okay, let's do the second piece of this. So the next piece of it is kind of about explaining finance. And maybe I'll just start with a little story. When this book came out, which was in April of last year, I did what geeky authors do, which is I went to every bookstore I could find and I asked them if they had the book, which is what you do on pub date because you want to make sure your publisher is doing their job. Anyway, so I go to my last bookstore of the day, which is on Mass Ave in Cambridge. It's called the Harvard Bookstore, and I go in there, and it's a little curious thing to ask for your own book, but I did it anyway. And so I said, excuse me, I'm just curious if you have this book. It just came out today. It's called How Finance Works. And the guy behind the counter smiled, and I thought to myself, this is good. He smiled. It must mean people have been like falling all over themselves to ask him about the book today. And he smiled and he typed it into his computer. And then he said, How Finance Works, does that have a question mark at the end? And I didn't even understand what he was saying because I was so excited to find out if he had the book. But of course, what he was saying, I realized as I was walking out, was who would write a book called How Finance Works without a question mark? Like as if finance works. That doesn't make any sense. And as I walked away, I thought to myself, that's precisely what the prevailing skepticism about finance is, which is obviously finance doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It's all gross and disgusting and occupy, blah, blah, blah. So this book and the course Leading with Finance really tries to unpack all the big ideas of finance in this way. And one of the important things that I do in the book, I think that many places don't do, is just try to ask the question this guy was asking, which is, why can't life be simple? And why is finance so complicated? And I use this picture to motivate this, which is, in a simple world, what would happen? And the answer is, there would be the good people who have capital, those would be the households, and there would be the good people, the managers who need that capital. We would give them capital, they would give us returns, and life would be good. And the question is, why can't life be simple? Because in fact, the world looks like this. And it's this entire mess of finance. And what does it look like? And the answer is, yeah, we have those good people who are households, and we have those good people who are companies, and then we got all this junk in the middle. And that junk in the middle is the institutional investors and the pension funds and the endowment funds and the mutual funds and the investment banks and the broker dealers and the analysts and the media. And there's money going in every direction. There are incentives that are all crazy in this kind of picture. And there's information going in every direction. And most people, when they look at this picture, they say, why can't life be simple? What are all those people in the middle doing? And if they're not doing something productive, we should get rid of them because it's like 15% of GDP or something. And so what is it that they're all doing? My answer to that is in part that actually a lot of finance is about solving one of the biggest problems of modern capitalism. And in fact, that's why it is so interesting and compelling as a field and why it's so important and why it can't be demonized. Not, again, to say everything they're doing is great, but just understand what the problem is and what is that problem. And of course, the problem is the biggest problem of modern capitalism, which is what? The separation of ownership and control, which is just a way of saying 150 years ago, most of us had the privilege of working for ourselves. What's the fundamental nature of today? We have ownership and we have control, and they're separated, which is a way of saying I own some Apple shares, but Tim Cook doesn't always take my calls. And I can't always tell if he's doing the right thing by me. I'm the owner, he's in control. I'm the principal, he's my agent. But it turns out when ownership is really dispersed, that whole problem is really hard. And by the way, guess who has all the information about these companies? Those managers. And can I trust them? And the answer is not entirely. And so that begets the biggest problem in finance, which is how do we end up bridging these worlds and making communication and information work in this world? And that is in some sense why finance is so fascinating. Once you think about this problem, many things in finance, I think, make a ton of sense. And I'll take you through a couple of them. So what does that mean? So that problem of asymmetric information, which is just another way of saying, by the way, who's got all the information? The managers. Can I believe what they say? No, it's one huge signaling problem that we're trying to work our way through. Once you understand that world and you see how relevant it is, a lot of things that happen in the world, I think, make more sense. So specifically, CEO announces a small earnings miss. She says, I missed by a penny. We promised 25 cents. It turned into 24. Don't worry about it. It was the weather. No big deal. And the response is the stock tanks. Well, why? And the answer is, wait a second. When you miss by a penny, I just learned something about you. You might be a liar, and you might be somebody I can't trust. And so I take you to the woodshed. Similarly, the CEO, CFO announces a big share buyback. Stock rises. People will tell you all kinds of crazy ideas about fewer shares outstanding. None of it makes any sense. The reality is, wait a second, the people with all the information just told me that they think their stock is cheap. Buy. You know, CEO announces, as for strictly portfolio diversification and tax purposes, I will be selling some shares. It's not a big deal. It's just a portfolio rebalancing. Don't worry about it. What do you think if you're on the outside? Liar. The person with all the information is selling. That's what this whole information game is. What is private equity? Private equity in part is an asset class which says, I'm going to take you out of this world and I'm going to fix all these problems by being one big owner and I sit on top of you. And of course, they don't like to talk about it, but they have a host of their own problems that are associated with the principal agent problem. But that is in part an explanation for that. The people who you think of as being evil, the activist shareholders and short sellers, are maybe the heroes. Why? No one else will tell you anything negative in this world. And the activists are people who solve this collective action problem. Now, of course, they're not really heroes. They have their own problems, it turns out, again, associated with the principal agent problem and the people who they raise money from. Finally, I'll just mention, it's also what we've been doing for the last 30 years, which is experimenting with equity compensation, which is let's load up those managers with stock because then they'll do right by us, solving this problem. Of course, that turns out to create its own problems associated with vesting and all kinds of other issues. And finally, it helps explain why people in finance are obsessed with cash rather than profits. People in finance love to talk about cash and they love to talk about EBITDA and free cash flow and operating cash flow. And that whole language has developed in the last 30 years because we don't believe in profits. And that's the underlying idea in finance. Okay, great. We're going to run out of time and I don't want to kind of squelch you on the Q&A time. There's a little bit of stuff about cash. Final thing just to talk about is personal finance, and just give you some thoughts about this that I've been developing with some friends and hopefully will come to fruition, which is, you know, first, personal finance is like, the stuff out there is kind of terrible. And it's missing, I think, I'd be interested to know if you think so. I think it's kind of missing a lot of rigor. And it's missing this identity question, which is, it's got to actually be a lot more personal and less about money in some abstract sense. So in this project, what we've been thinking about doing is focusing on 6 big topics and really thinking through what the underlying identity questions are and what the really good, rigorous way to think about these are. And so here are the 6 ones we've thought about a lot, but I'm curious to know what you would think. First is just about budgets and savings and the centrality of that. Again, sounds kind of super boring, but hugely important and actually has a lot to do with the way you live your life. You got to get a couple of big decisions right in life. You got to get housing right. You got to get education right. It turns out those, again, are about identity as much as they are about money. Debt, obviously, is a hugely important piece of this problem, and thinking about what good debt is and bad debt is and how you think about that problem. And then finally, retirement. And how do I really create not just savings, but wealth? And then what do I think about transferring that? So that would be like a way to think about what the topics are. And again, this is very early, but if you have thoughts about it, that would be great. And then I'll just walk you through a set of ideas about it, and then we'll pause for Q&A. So with savings and budgets, much discussed, little practiced, and the underlying identity issue is it's really about creating a sense of control. And actually, in the process of creating a budget, you choose the kind of life you want to live. And then maybe most importantly, you make sure that savings is a really big part of it. Here's like a very simple way to think about the world, which is what happens to money that comes in the door? And the answer is you eat it or you save it. And budgeting is not just about the kind of eating you do, which is housing and education, maybe entertainment, but also about that division between consumption and savings. Underneath it all, what we are trying to think through is, well, how do we kind of come up with some rules or ideas that'll help you kind of see this budgeting process as a form of identity? So for example, by choosing ratios, you're choosing the kind of life you want to live. by choosing a certain amount of savings or choosing a certain amount of spending on housing, that's a different kind of life than if you chose different ratios. And that makes budgeting really about the kind of life you want to live, in addition to being about making sure that savings is a big part of your life and thinking about the habits that you're going to create in that process. Okay, I really wanted to make sure and try to stay on time. I'm not going to go through all of this in part because we're just trying to think about it now. But here's what I hope you take away from this little time together, which is we got to fix finance, and fixing finance is in part about demystifying finance. And how do we do that? And my answer to that is we've got to humanize finance, and that is about trying to really think through not screens and spreadsheets, but the human beings who are subject to the decisions that we make when we look at screens and spreadsheets. And it turns out the humanities is like an incredibly powerful way to think about that world. And actually, finance themselves has a noble set of ideas. And if we can live by the nobility of those ideas, maybe we can improve the practice of finance. Second is all about explaining finance, which is just a way of saying when somebody from finance tries to intimidate you, or if you are in finance and you find yourself meaninglessly using acronyms, stop it. It's actually about the most important problems of modern capitalism, and there are intuitive ideas about value creation, about how do we analyze things financially, capital allocation, that are really important, and they're accessible to everybody. And that's what the online course is about, and that's what the book is about. And maybe most speculatively, I think there's a lot we can do to personalize finance, to make it more accessible, and to make it something which is rigorous, but still basically intuitive. And really think hard about the most important financial decisions that we make and how to do that in a more thoughtful way. Okay, that was a lot, and it was super fast. And Natalie, I think I promised to be done by 11:30. So not bad, I'm a minute early. So let's do the more interesting thing, which is Q&A.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. We did get a couple really great questions, so we're just going to move on to that portion of the event here. So we did get a few questions from people who want to use finance at work, but they themselves are not finance professionals. So the question is, if you're in marketing, or if you're in strategy, or if you're in some other non-finance field, how can you use finance to become more influential and to make better decisions at work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I really think it's important for people who are not in finance to get more conversant in finance, because I think you can top out if you don't become more conversant in finance. And as I mentioned, many people just don't want to deal with it. So obviously the book, How Finance Works, is all about that, as is the online course. I think, what do you do in your life day to day? And I think the first thing is you call up a buddy in the finance department and you make friends with them, and you go to lunch with them. And they're typically, can be somewhat lonely types, and they would love to be asked to lunch. So ask them to lunch, and start to talk to them about the way they analyze decisions. And when you make a request for a certain budget, how do they analyze it? And what do they spend all their time doing? And I think in that process, you'll come to understand finance better. So the first is make a buddy in the finance department, really try to reach out to them and think through the way they do it. Second thing is, and of course, obviously, I think the books are great, and the online course is great. The second thing is, start maybe doing a little investing, and not crazy, but maybe have a little, like, instead of a book club, have a little finance club where you tear apart a company and you start to look at the financials and you listen to the conference call and you do that whole thing with a buddy and you kind of make it fun. Yeah, and then the final thing is just start to really pay attention to the financial world. It is a rich and intellectually deep world. Start reading about it and start asking questions. And during that process of educating yourself with books and courses, educating yourself by reaching out to the finance folks, and then educating yourself by investing and talking to your buddies, I think that's the best way to kind of really make finance a bigger part of your life.
Okay, so the next one that came in, we actually had a couple that were around economic policy, and I know that you've done a fair amount of research in taxes, and you're an expert in that field. So this is, if you had a magic wand and if you could change one thing about the US tax policy overnight, what would it be, and what would you change, and why?
Wow, that's a great question. So I do teach tax law at HLS, and I, as an economist, have done a lot of work in tax policy. I guess I'll say maybe three things. The first thing is I was really I was really invested in the idea of changing the corporate tax system, which we started to do in the TCJA for the Americans in the audience. And I think we made some good decisions there. I think we could simplify that a whole bunch more and do more in that direction. But I think more broadly, I would do two things. First, I would think hard about enforcement. I mean, I think we're dramatically under-resourced in enforcement, and I think we should really think hard about that. I think second, we should think seriously about a consumption tax. The United States is one of the only places without a consumption tax, and specifically maybe a carbon tax and a consumption tax, because I think we're going to need that revenue, and I think it's a powerful way to do that. And then finally, and this is really in the weeds, but for those of you who like this stuff, I mean, I think we need to rethink realization and the whole underlying idea that we don't tax people on gains as they accrue, but only when they realize. So yeah, consumption tax, carbon tax, enforcement, and get away from realization. That's probably more than you bargained for, but yeah.
So a couple questions about financial metrics. So we had a question from actually two people, both Yvonne and Vlad, and they both asked about how companies tend to use a lot of different financial KPIs or metrics, and it's not necessarily standard in terms of how they report and the types of metrics that they use. So in your opinion, what are the best financial indicators that companies should be using to reflect the financial health of a company?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And you're absolutely right to just note the proliferation of them, which is a way of saying people have now got non-GAAP and non-GAAP pro forma and, all kinds of ways to talk about things that I think are in some sense kind of more obscuring the reality than helping with the underlying reality. So first is to be clear that I think fewer metrics are more useful than more metrics. And then you have to really pick those well. And they have to be aligned with obviously the strategic vision of the company. So it depends where you are in your growth cycle and what you're trying to accomplish, but the strategic goals of the company have got to be mirrored in the way we think about our KPIs. So it's hard to speak about generically. Having said that, I think what we want to be focused on is for a whole bunch of folks, we really want to be thinking about things that are centered on value and thinking about how we create value, which is largely about beating your cost of capital and what our return on capital is. And to some degree also how we think about free cash flow and the asset intensity of our business. Now, of course, if you're in a startup, then that's not what it's about, right? You got to be thinking about growth and you got to be thinking about revenue growth largely. But the short answer to your question is one, it's got to be lined up with strategy. And the second answer has got to be, which really should be focused on value and creating value. And that's like one of the biggest ideas in finance. And that's the way it should be done. And typically that kind of gets down to thinking about your return on capital, especially with respect to your cost of capital.
So we had a question come in from Jim on Facebook, and you touched a little bit on personal finance and how a lot of it is just making some really big decisions correctly. His question was specifically for people who are young and maybe starting off in their own personal finance journey. Maybe they're in their first or second job out of college, they're in their own place for the first time. Do you have like 2 or 3 pieces of advice or just some core things that they should think about when they're making those kind of early financial decisions to set themselves up for success long term?
Sure. So I mean, I think the most important thing when you're young is to make savings a big part of your life and to create a habit of savings. And so what people get wrong when they think about budgeting is it's all about, I want to spend X percent, I want to spend 50% on housing, and I'm going to spend 30% on, food, and I got another 20% for vacations and blah, blah, blah. And then savings is just like the residual, if there is any. And I think what you want to do early in your life is make savings core to who you are. And so what does that mean? Well, straight off the top, 20% is savings. And you just get used to that and you do it. It doesn't matter what the dollar amount is. It just means something that you created a habit of making that a commitment. And the reason why that's important, and it's very hard because when you're young in your life, you make less, obviously, than you do over the course of your life. And it's harder to save when you're young. But it's about the habit formation that we're really thinking about. And so creating that habit and the forced savings, before you see it, it's gone from your hands and in someone else's hands. I think that is just a hugely important thing. And that's what budgeting should be. And so I think first kind of making savings a habit, making it the first decision, not a residual of all your other consumption decisions. And then really thinking hard about your budgeting as not just like, oh, I got to do this because my parents told me to, but I got to do this because actually, if I spend 50% of my housing, what does that mean? Well, it means much better commute, maybe better nightlife, but it also means worse vacations and not having the ability to go out and do other things. So I'm not saying which one is right, but make a conscious choice of the kind of life you want to live, because that's what that budgeting decision is about, not just some silly spreadsheet that you're trying to track expenses on.
So the next question is from Chris, who's joining us on Zoom, and he was asking about the perspective of investors, and he's drawing a distinction between maybe older generations of investors who are really just primarily concerned about getting the most return and getting the most bang for their buck. Have you noticed, or do you think there is a movement towards investors becoming more interested in companies' social responsibility or other elements that might be less focused on a pure financial return?
Yeah, that's a great, I'm sorry, who asked that?
Chris on Zoom.
So Chris, it's a great question. And I hate to break it to you, but I'm going to be like an old fuddy-duddy about this, which is all my colleagues love this stuff. They love this stakeholder capitalism stuff and social responsibility stuff. And I get it. But I'm not as big a fan as they are. And I know it's all the rage today, but I'm not as big a fan. And the reasons are because I worry largely about that basic problem about investors and managers and that principal agent problem. And I think in that context, giving license to managers to solve the world's problems can compound the problem they face with respect to investors. That's number one. I think number two, I think we're tricking ourselves if we think the biggest problems we face as societies, particularly climate change, are going to be solved by voluntary actions by companies. I don't think that's the case. I think it requires the state. And I think oddly, this effort can undercut the efforts of states to really solve these underlying problems. And I don't think it's realistic to do this. Third, I think it's kind of ill-formed to suggest that they should have all these stakeholders. If you're a global multinational firm, which community are you supposed to serve? How? How do you trade them off against each other? It feels like motherhood and apple pie, but it is not. It is just not clear and directive as to how people make decisions. So I think the fact that it's going to compound the underlying problem that we talked about in finance, the fact that might undercut the efforts of states, which is the proper locus for these decisions to be made, and the fact that it is non-directive and doesn't actually help managers think through hard decisions, I think is problematic. And I get that that sounds horrible, and I get that everybody wants to love this stuff. I just think it's dramatically under-theorized, and it's dramatically, can actually lead to a lot of bad consequences that we're not thinking through. Boy, that was a downer, Natalie. I'm sorry.
No, no, I'll bring it back up here.
Okay, good. Good for you.
So we've had a few people who either have taken your course or are interested in taking your course, or just learning more about finance in general. So both Claire and Rizwan wrote in, and they're asking, maybe in addition to your course, as well as some of the books that you've mentioned, what are some, and you also mentioned making friends with finance people at your organization. Are there any books or resources or journals, newspapers, anything that you feel like are great resources for people who are just looking to incorporate financial learning into their everyday life?
Yeah, so obviously the books I've written and then the resources that we talked about, I think are the most important ways to think about it. If you go deeper, I'll give you a couple of other thoughts. First, if you get really interested, the references section of the Wisdom of Finance book has a whole bunch of suggestions for how to dig into those ideas more deeply. If you're interested in those ideas, books like Capital Ideas by Peter Bernstein is a really nice way to start to learn a lot of those ideas. But I confess that I think the best way to really get at this stuff is to talk with friends and to start to investigate a company. So pick a company. Let's talk about Facebook, because I think we're probably streaming on Facebook. All right, well, should you buy the stock? Okay, well, what does that question really mean? What that question really means, and you could answer that question by just saying, well, my buddy told me to buy that stock, so I'm going to buy that stock. And that's a pretty silly way to live your life. But think about all the things you should try to understand that question. The answer is, well, wait a second, I have to think about advertising. So I got to understand the advertising market. which means I got to understand the macro economy. I got to think about shifting trends in digital advertising. I got to think about regulation, because I got to think if they're going to get regulated as a publisher, Section 230 of the FCC Act gets changed, and maybe they're going to have to hire a bunch of people and they're going to change their cost structure. And then I got to think about politics, and then I got to think about the demographics, and I got to think about TikTok, and I got to think about the aging demographics of Facebook. And that is why finance is so much fun. When you go down all those questions and you think to yourself, man, to really understand this company, I got to understand a lot about the world. That is a fun and rewarding thing to do. And that's how you learn finance, because then you say to yourself, man, they used to have like 60% EBITDA margins and they're coming down. Why is that? And is that good or is that bad? And how's it growing and how much more? Are they gonna have pricing power in these markets? Blah, blah, blah. That's finance. And that is really fun. It's not about like, debits and credits. It's about something much bigger than that.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for one more question. So this will be our last one. And this is from Bobby, who's joining us on Zoom. And his question is, for CFOs, regardless of company or industry, is there a top concern or top couple concerns that they really should be thinking about as they plan for their company's future?
Wow, so that's a big question. I mean, I think from a financial perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that we stress in finance and the way we think about this is, it's one thing to be a manager, it's another thing to also think like an investor. And I think if you are leading a company today, for better or worse, you have to think like an investor. And what that means is you have to think as a steward of other people's capital. And so really thinking hard about capital allocation, understanding why that is the dominant frame for investors on how you think about the world, I think is a really important way to think about the world. Not just managing day to day, but how do you think about those bigger capital allocation questions that are really going to be fundamental to the way the future of your company and how it evolves. So yeah, that's what I would kind of think about there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up. We're just about time.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Professor Desai, for sharing all your expertise and your insights. And to everyone who's joining us from wherever you're joining us from, thank you for joining us today and submitting really great questions. If you're interested in registering for Leading with Finance, the next wave starts on October 28th. The application for that wave of the course is due on October 19th. You can register for that course as well as find more information on all of our HBS online courses at online.hbs.edu. And I just want to say thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
See ya.